Hey up lads and lasses, Damphyre here, back again with some more Infinite Lagrange. Today we are looking at the carriers. I am going to add on the auxiliary in a separate tier as well into this video because it's only 3 carriers to really cover and there's only 2 auxiliary ships to cover, and it's difficult to rank them because of that. It's like, well, do you put one in S or one in D or the other way around and that kind of thing with the auxiliary ships, and their use case is very different, or the uses I've found for them, or people have told me their uses for, is a bit awkward. So we're going to jump into the carriers now, and then I'm going to cut over to the auxiliary a little bit later on. We'll talk a little bit about each ship, we'll talk about the uses of the ships, and so on and so forth. But first off, the carriers, as you can see from the last time I did this, like over a year ago, we have in S tier the CV3K, A tier the Martial Crux and the Solar Whale. Like I said, there's only 3 ships, you can't really knock them. They are carriers and they are capable of, you know, flying in your large fighters, and the Martial Crux is bringing a giant weapon system. The Solar Whale's slow, but it's bringing a giant amount of bombers and stuff. CV3K, sort of reliable because it does a bit of everything. So I want to re-rank them a little bit, because something I didn't actually really take into account was, because there's almost like a no CP cost on carriers, due to the fact that you genuinely just use them as reinforcements. You just run 5, you run them in reinforce, and you just reinforce whichever fleet is necessary to reinforce at that time for you. Maybe you reinforce your main fleet, you reinforce your flank fleet, all that kind of stuff. So something that I didn't take into account was, due to that reinforcement, and there's kind of like a lack of a CP cost in that regard, things like the CV3K probably don't compete quite as well with things like the Solar Whale. So I want to move the CV3K down. Now, the CV3K is a very good carrier. Well, you've only got 3 choices anyway, right? It goes up to 11 aircraft in total with corvettes, a mixture of corvettes and fighter bombers, which is actually pretty decent. And then the Martial Crux has 9. The Solar Whale bringing that all the way up to 16 potential is kind of crazy, because if you actually think about how much CP that saves you in fleet, it adds up pretty quickly. So if you have 5 Solar Whales, they have 5 more aircraft than the CV3K. That leaves you in a position where you have, well, 25 more aircraft in that reinforcement fleet. That's a lot of aircraft. That is what, 6 and a bit Jaegers if they were corvettes. That's a lot of CP saved. A lot of CP saved. And that allows you to have a more robust fleet in itself. So you can have more front row ships, you can have more support ships now. You can do weird things like have ST-59s in the actual fleet itself because they're only 28 CP. You can do some really interesting things because you're saving the amount of carrier CP cost within the fleet, because you do want to carry, you know, your Jaegers in, you do want to carry some Predators in, but you don't have to carry all 10 of them. I run 5 Jaeger, I run 2 Predator, and literally because everything else goes on the Solar Whales. So I'm actually going to move the Solar Whale up to S tier. If you have the modules for it to run the 16 aircraft, it is the best carrier. I know it's slow and it's horrible to use because of the speed of the thing and the speed it makes the fleet, but it just makes that whole fleet as a whole just a stronger fighting force, because, like I mentioned, you don't need to have as many Jaeger or Predator or Guardian or anything like that within the fleet to carry anything, because the Solar Whale's doing all the heavy lifting, quite literally. So I'm going to move the Solar Whale up. This CV3K is going to come down to A tier, because again, 11 aircraft's actually nothing to, you know, knock. It's really quite capable. And, you know, you get the benefits of it being faster. So it has a sort of better usage, or it feels better to use. but I just can't knock the strength of an entire fleet when you have a solar whale reinforcement in comparison to a CV3K reinforcement. Now, the Martial Crux. This is a difficult one to, I find anyway, to really talk about, because it's in this weird position where it's like halfway between a battle cruiser and halfway between a carrier. At base, it has bugger all carrying capability, basically. Whereas, even the CV3K does better than it, and the Solar Whale does better than it. But you get the giant weapon, and the weapon's good. It's not a bad weapon, it's energy damage. And okay, there is a railgun for it as well, but I just don't recommend running the railgun personally. I'd stick to the M1 slot, which is the energy weapon. And if you are coming against these super heavy fleets, that added damage that the Martial Cruxes actually brings in adds up quite quickly. And all of a sudden, you've got a carrier that's dealing decent damage, carrying stuff in. It's limited though, I think it goes to 9 aircraft max off the top of my head. I think that's what it goes to. And it really struggles with like a choice between Corvette heavy or fighter heavy and that kind of thing. It doesn't balance out quite as well as, say, like the Solar Whale, where you could lose 2 fighters to gain two fighters to switch to 6 Corvettes instead, and that kind of thing. So I think the Martial Crux is going to stay where it is in A tier, and I think it's mostly because it desperately needs the mods to run as a carrier. But at the same time, you're getting that added weapon damage, and it's almost a battle cruiser level kind of damage that this thing's dishing out with all the bits added on of being a carrier. And like I said, if you have the right parts for it, 9 aircraft is not bad. It's only 2 less than the CV3K. You've got the same movement speed, and you bring a giant bloody weapon into the fight. It can really dish out some great damage, and then it's got all its fighter accompaniment, and that is, I think that's where the strength of the Martial Crux lies. What I think you might start seeing is within that super heavy fleet, you might have a Solar Whale reinforcement of 5 ships. You may go for a 6 frontline ST-59, go for your CAS support ships, and if you've got a little extra CP, or maybe you don't want all the CAS in, maybe you only have like 5 of the CAS in your 400 CP fleet, you might try and sneak in a couple of Martial Cruxes to add in a bit of damage and add in a bit extra carrying capability in there as well. Obviously, you may try and go a different route and add in your Jaegers and your Predators and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think the Martial Crux it's a good ship. I don't think it's quite as versatile as the CV3K. That being said, it's got its own version of versatility, bringing its own decent weaponry system into the battle, and carrying capability, obviously. So, the Martial Crux, definitely going to stick it into A tier. CV3K, probably the more versatile of all of them. But the Solar Whale, just its sheer carrying capability just allows you to increase the robustness of your main fleet in itself, because you don't need as much carrying capability within the fleet to hit, say, 120 fighters, 120 aircraft, or whatever you're trying to do. So that is the tier list for the carriers. Again, probably a little bit short, so I will be adding on the auxiliary now. So we'll switch over to those now. So I can't actually make a tier list for the auxiliary ships, because apparently you need now, I don't know when this changed, a minimum of 5 images, and obviously there's only 2 ships, so a little bit awkward there. How that allowed me to make the carrier one, then I don't know. It must have been back when I made the carriers, it was fine, and you could have however many, but now, as you can see, in here instead. So I was just going to talk about them, and I'll tell you where I kind of rank them in, well, more about the grand scheme of things, because they don't really sit in fleets. So the Eddie Karen, which is a shame, because this thing is awesome. This is one of the best looking ships in the game, and I genuinely don't like the Noma ships for the most part, with the exception of this one, because I think this looks awesome. The asymmetries actually looks good on this. because you've got the carrier side on one side and then the rest. Yeah. Anyway, enough about looks. It's got nothing to do with looks. The Ark ships are in a weird position. They are relatively useless within the grand scheme of fleets, and the reason being is they don't provide necessarily anything, like, at all, and it puts you in a position where you never see them, you don't use them. The FSV's got, like, really cool buffs too. I mean, you look at the FSV and it can do things like off the back rows, and you get increased warp speeds, and, like, you'd think it'd be really good, but, you know, look, chance of back row ships in the fleet being hit by projectile weapons reduction, chance of mid rows being hit by projectile weapons reduction, and slow weapons, and, you know, it's got some really interesting attributes, and it comes with a passive 8% anyway, so, you know, back row torp and back row missile evasion is 8%, which is quite nice, and then you add on some extra bits and pieces. And it's just they don't work. The fact that you can only have one in fleet, it has to be in fleet to get these benefits as well. I don't believe they work on the reinforce, and it has to be, well, the flagship, which means you're giving up the flagship abilities of Winged Hussar, ST-59, Spear, with its you will sit there and take all the damage in the face before I let you go. You know, there's just better flagships. So the flagship skills on the FSVs are really cool, and if they were maybe in a position where maybe you'd have the flagships as a spear, but these were still, you know, triggering these back row missile reductions and that kind of thing, you'd probably go, okay, that might actually be worth running in a fleet. All of a sudden, your Xenos are, you know, tankier because they're getting hit less, or your Jaeger and Predator are getting hit less because they've got these sort of inbuilt dodge rates now, thanks to the FSV as an example. But they're not good enough, really, to run in fleets. And at 40 CP, that's 10% of your entire fleet CP cap on a single ship. You could have, well, a lot more damage output as an example. Ignore the fleet battle thing, because I'm doing this in game. I'm just, like, permanently getting attacked by pirates yet again. So yeah, so these get now used as either a forward operating base where they just blew up one of my miners. I'll get my revenge later. So it puts these in a position where you either use them as a forward operating base, because you can now dock to them, kind of like you dock to the stations, you know, to do the trading stuff. You kind of dock them, and then you can, like, build ships out of them and that kind of thing. But then you're limited to a single ship type at any given point. And because you can't have, say, one Edia Karen, because the Edia Karen is the only thing that can just build the destroyers, the FSV can't. Obviously, you need the destroyer production system as well, which is, you know, means you need a duplicate and get really bloody lucky to get that. So it's rare to see, because mostly the only time I've ever seen the modules on these things is, like, the mega whales who, you know, have everything unlocked and have spent like £1 million. But so you have them on the front, you dock up to them, you build your ships that you've just lost, and then you go back out. But at the same time, you can do that with your fleet anyway. You just retreat it back to base and then fly it back out. And they're a little bit slower to build things like destroyers and frigates than your bases anyway. And now that we've got the new base building system, we can just build whatever ship you bloody want from the start of the game. It kind of made these, like, even more so redundant than before. Like, one of the things that people were using these for, myself included at one point, was I had an FSV parked outside my base, literally just outside, pumping out aircraft. Because you know what happens. You fly into an enemy fleet and they've got swarm as well. Both of you just lose all your bloody aircraft, and now you've got to sit there for like a day almost to replace all your aircraft. Which is fine. So you would sit an FSV outside your base, and now you've got double the amount of aircraft production. Of maybe on this one, I tend to run the Corvette building on this one, and then I'll let my base do the bombers and that kind of thing. So this would be pumping out Corvettes. That base are pumping out the aircraft, but now I don't need it because the base can do 2 rows of aircraft at the same time, and it's taken me half time. Okay, I could put an extra FSV out. You could go hardcore and, you know, FSVs out and start pumping out aircraft. Now you've got 3 production lines of aircraft coming out, and it will definitely be quicker that way. But that's literally the only uses. Forward operation base, where you're rebuilding bits of your fleet near maybe an enemy swarm or something like that, so you can just keep the pressure up. Or, like I said, just building aircraft back at base, next to your base, so you just have more aircraft production. And that is literally the only uses of the ARC ships at the current moment. Again, I just can't rate them. They're not... They're just not good enough for anything. The frigate production, the ability to produce ships out in the field is amazing. It's really, really nice, but it's slow. It costs a fortune, and it's limited. If the FSV could sit there and it could build frigates, destroyers, and my aircraft, 100% every fleet I'd have one in. The fact that it can only build frigates and the aircraft means I'm just never going to run it. There was no reason to, other than supplying my main fleet, using it as a forward operation base. So it's a shame, because like the buffs are nice. Like I said, like an 8%, it'd be good. If these were allowed, either they cost maybe 0 CP, I'd probably run one in the fleet just for the buffs at that point. Oh, and the buffs, you know, these buffs, they'd have to be in a position where they didn't need to be the flagship for these to, you know, take effect. Because there are better flagships. I run Wing Tissar as my flagship, because, you know, it's crazy what that can do with mixed in with Mistrals that sat on Tundra. And now you've got hit rate bonuses out the wazoo on Mistrals, and all of a sudden they're just absolutely shredding through enemy aircraft. You know, like, there is no way I'd ever use this, which is a shame, because, you know, having the sailing and warp speed at 80% plus 10% of all average ships would be fantastic, because you could run your solar whales then and be like, hey, look, this isn't absolutely unbearable to sit here and wait 20 minutes for that fleet to move about 5 inches. So yeah, that's the ARC ships for you. They're unrankable because they don't get used in fleets. They can be used as like a mini base to help production line, and that is literally about it, which is, again, unfortunate, because I think the buffs are quite cool, and it would be nice to have them in fleets, because you get the little, you know, the extra cool fleet icon, which is an FSV. Yeah, maybe I think these need a bit of a rework. Maybe I'll suggest something today. Let me know down in the description what you suggest would make these usable and make you run them in a fleet. Because you can only have one oven fleet, so I don't think it's like unreasonable to have these in a position where it's like you get the flagship regardless of which flagship is actually the flagship. Something like that. Like those buffs, if they're just a flat buff, it didn't have to be flagship, you'd probably run it. I think that's all they need. I mean, even at 10% of your 40 CP, at 10% of your total fleet, you know, 80% of your fleet's movement speed. You got solar whales in there. Now you're moving like 600 instead of, well, maybe not 600, depending on what your fleet is, but you get what I mean. You'll be moving faster regardless. Something like that would be really, really good. And I think literally just that one change. Have these abilities not tied to flagships and you'd probably do alright. I don't think the buffs, the 8% and the back row and these buffs here don't affect, but things like the sailing speed coordination is tied to the flagships. So yeah, it's a bit unfortunate. Anyway, yeah, auxiliary ships, can't even make a tier list for them. Wouldn't make a tier list for them. Because they don't get used in fleet, unfortunately. So there you go. Auxiliary ships, use them as production, additional production. That's it. That's all you can do. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll catch you next time.